Energy Media readers, today we're going to be talking to Professor Werner Antweiler, and he is a professor of economics at the Sauder School of Business. And we'll be talking about the second age of electricity. So welcome, Professor Antweiler.
Hello, Markham. It's good to talk to you.
Now, I interviewed you earlier this year for my book, and we talked about the second age of electricity, which essentially I interpret as meaning the electrification of everything. Essentially, we're going to be switching from fossil fuels as our primary energy source, which is about 82% globally right now. And let's say that we flip that on its head and 82% or 80 is electricity generated by low or zero carbon technologies like wind, solar, tidal, all of that sort of thing. So could you give me your take on this transition to the second age of electricity?
Yeah, I think there is great potential to change a lot of services that currently rely on fossil fuels to using electricity. And there are some areas where it's going to be easier and some areas that's going to be harder. We already see the transition happening for electric vehicles. There was a massive investment by automakers into the new batteries that we will need to make electric vehicles a affordable reality and not just a technical reality. We're generally expecting something called battery parity in the mid-2020s, and that means the point where electric vehicles will be competitive fully to internal combustion engine vehicles. Now, it will be more difficult in other areas, for example, ships and airplanes, simply because they need a lot more power and batteries are quite heavy, and so this transition will be much slower in some sectors. But in terms of weaning ourselves off fossil fuels, it really requires two things to come together. One is you need a cheap source of electricity that's essentially cheaper than fossil fuels. And we need the ability to transmit this electricity to where we need it and to store it because many sources of renewable energy are intermittent. Now, that is a challenge ahead. And once these two things come into place, is that we reach the point where electricity is sufficiently cheap and storable, then we will see significant changes in the way we consume energy.
Now, my understanding from a study by the Rocky Mountain Institute and interviews with some EV experts is that we may actually be very close to the $100 a kilowatt hour mark already with batteries. There's a little bit of dispute around that. Volkswagen is hinting that it has already reached that, but some people are skeptical. Fair enough. But surely we'll reach it within 2, 3, 4 years. And this Rocky Mountain Institute study says that we'll have a new generation of batteries by 2030, and that will be solid state and probably $50 a kilowatt hour. So it sounds like you agree with that. Is that at the point really where electrification, if we think of the S curve as a hockey stick, we've got to the toe of the hockey stick, and then we're on the shaft with rapid ascent in terms of adoption?
Yes, economics always applies, and that is something has to be cheaper than something else to really become a dominant form of use. And we see that happened actually with the internal combustion engine in the 20th century, when essentially that became a more affordable solution than what was at the time actually already electric vehicles too. But the point we will be getting to in the next few years for sure, in part because there is scaling up going on. We have all heard about the gigafactory that Tesla has been putting into place together with Panasonic. And so there will be more efforts to scale up the production of batteries. And we're getting to better battery technology itself, more energy density. That means we can store more energy per kilogram of weight. We will see a safer generation of batteries that use solid state rather than liquid polymers in batteries. So there is huge innovation underway because we see big companies, the car makers, being committed to producing that. But it won't stop there, because in addition to putting batteries into vehicles, we will also see these batteries in storage at wind farms. We will see storage possible through a connected grid and net metering. And so the one other piece that needs to come into place is a smarter grid. And that means significant infrastructure investment that have to happen from the utilities and from governments. And that is where things are a little bit slower because the planning horizon is much longer than for buying a new car.
A couple of weeks ago, I interviewed Professor Lucas Davis from Berkeley, and we were talking about a blog post that he wrote where he described how the United States had arrived in 2017, I think, at 38% of all US households heat their homes with electricity. That's a very, very high percentage. And he said that it was because it was in states where electricity was less expensive than it was in, say, other states. And so the economics made sense. Now, if we have cheap, abundant, renewable energy, can we apply that principle or that example of heating in the US to other industries so that we can say cheap, abundant electricity now gets us to electrify things that maybe we couldn't do before?
Yes, the economics is still true. If it's cheaper, we're going to use it. We actually see it in those jurisdictions here in Canada where we have cheap hydro, Quebec, Manitoba, British Columbia. Electricity is being used for heating purposes, whereas in other places it's mostly natural gas. So the economics really matters, and the same applies to electric vehicles. Now, for example, in Canada, in many jurisdictions, electricity is cheaper than in even parts in the United States. And it's also cleaner because we have hydro in the mix, and the majority of our electricity in Canada already is clean, unlike what happens in the eastern grid in the United States. So we have a unique opportunity here in Canada too to make the case for transitioning to electric vehicles because of these unique advantages. It's clean, it's cheap, and it starts to compute earlier than in other places in the world.
Now, I have a question for you. I've wondered about this for a while. So let's assume that Canada continues to either build more hydro dams, as Quebec and Manitoba are planning to do, or installs a lot of solar and wind, which the prairie provinces could certainly do, and maybe even Ontario as well. If we had abundant, cheap electricity, and I'm talking now maybe down around the 3 to 5 cent kilowatt hour, would that then enable us to get a head start on other countries in terms of developing industries that rely on cheap, plentiful electricity? And I'm thinking all sorts of manufacturing, like 3D printing, that sort of thing?
Yeah, when we look at the industries that are really electricity intensive, things like aluminum smelting and various other things, yeah, there is a comparative advantage. We see countries that have cheap electricity attracting those electricity intensive businesses. The ones that are really mattering today in our economy are the clouds, cloud computing. And those cloud farms, they use an enormous amount of energy simply because they need to cool the processors. So cheap, clean energy is a very attractive feature in a world where IT plays a big role. Less so in manufacturing. I think manufacturing has a few niche areas where electricity does play a significant role, but I think it's really the IT sector and where we need to warehouse big data, where Canada could actually potentially gain a bit of an advantage compared to other locations. We see actually Iceland, of all places, attracting a lot of computing, unfortunately for Bitcoins and not for cloud storage, but where electricity is cheap, we see a comparative advantage happening.
This is very interesting because I spend a lot of time writing about and thinking about energy narrative. And when we talk about the Canadian energy narrative around switching to renewables, and I'm thinking primarily wind and solar, we think of it in terms of replacing coal. We think of it in terms of replacing maybe nuclear. But we rarely talk about it in terms of attracting industry as an economic development tool. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, it's of course a complex mix of factors that comes together when we attract industries. It's not just electricity that matters because it's not the only factor in the production process. Often it has to also come together with labor and capital and in that right constellation. When we look at IT, We know how important certain companies are in that sector, Amazon and Google and others, and they make decisions about location that aren't just driven by the cost of electricity, but also the cost of labor and the ability of hiring qualified personnel. And there we get agglomeration advantages to locations that have a critical mass of capital and labor. So I would be more hesitant to say, well, this is all working in Canada's favor. The fact that we have cheap electricity also means that we can export it, and that is what we see. We see new transmission lines being put into place in Ontario. Sometimes now they're crossing through lakes. We do see the potential for new high voltage direct current lines. So whether we gain in terms of the industrial footprint or whether we gain in terms of exporting electricity to the United States, it's probably going to be a mixture of those two.
Professor Antweiler, can you describe the difference between the first age of electricity and the second age of electricity?
Yeah, so the first age of electricity was the revolution that we had at the turn of the 20th century and the end of the 19th century, when electricity first was being used in various applications in industrial processes. And we saw electrification actually throughout the first part of the 20th century, reaching rural areas in Canada and the United States. And that has, of course, allowed many new processes to take place, from refrigeration that was very essential for various agricultural products to industrial activities that require machinery that runs on electricity. So all of this has taken the span of at least 50, 60 years to put into place the electricity grid and the various industries that depend on it. Now, in the second half of the 20th century, we saw a bit of a steady state of the electrical grid. It hadn't really matured very much beyond those points we reached 50 years earlier. We have seen more use of it, but essentially the technology hadn't really evolved. And now we're at a critical juncture where new technologies are entering this realm of the electrical system. That is, I would characterize it as intermittent energy, the use of new types of storage, and we are only at the beginning of this, because we haven't seen massively scaled ups of, say, flow batteries or other types of storage. But we're also seeing the smarter grid. We see new technologies in terms of net metering, so that individual households can be both consumers and producers of electricity. We see the rise of better forms of pricing of electricity. Now, 20 years ago, we all priced electricity at the wholesale level on the level of regions, big regions. Now we see the ability to use IT to calculate local marginal prices that allow us to pinpoint where electricity is in short supply and maybe put in more transmission capacity or more storage. And so the electricity grid is becoming a whole lot smarter than it was 20 years ago. And all combined, the smarter grid, the new technologies, and even at the level of transmission, we see high voltage direct current lines taking root everywhere from China to Brazil to North America, where we see massive investment into the infrastructure that wasn't actually very attractive 20 years ago. All that's coming together to revolutionize our electrical grid, our electrical infrastructure, and the ability to do new things with the electricity that we can harvest from renewable sources.
Now, everybody's talking about the pace of the energy transition these days, which amuses me to no end, because it wasn't, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, I would talk to people in particular in Alberta who were in the hydrocarbons industry, and they would say, just because you spell it with a capital E and a capital T doesn't make the energy transition real. And of course, now we know we have a much better handle on that. But what about pace? Are you, there are a number of schools of thought. We're going to have, some will argue that we're going to have a rapid pace, which means rapid electrification. And others will say, no, it's going to be slower. Where do you fall on that?
Well, I always look for tipping points, and these tipping points are reached when one technology becomes cheaper than something else. Then you see a massive change, because if my electric car is cheaper than my internal combustion car, it's a no-brainer. I'm going to buy the one that has all the right features, and is cheaper. And we see those trends happening when we reach those critical tipping points. And we look at that for electric vehicles in particular, which we call battery parity. And that is when batteries are sufficiently cheap, then we see the switch happening, because electricity per kilometer is already much cheaper than fossil fuel use for every kilometer. So at the level of the variable cost, we're already clearly there, but it's the cost upfront for the batteries that holds back this particular adoption. So I already see a trend towards more plug-in hybrids. Of course, we need complementarities too. It's not just the vehicle that needs to be cheaper. It also needs to include the cost of the charging stations. And here we need both public and private infrastructure that has to happen at the same time. New buildings now, by changes to the building code, will have charging stations built into the parkades of multi-unit residential buildings. And so the new generation of buildings will have this infrastructure. Others need to be retrofitted. And so this is what's really holding back a little bit of that process. Even if you reach grid parity for renewables and we reach battery parity for electric vehicles, we still need infrastructure to catch up. And so that is really what's holding back. So that prevents this tipping point from making this huge switch right away. And of course, there is the fact that when you own a car already, you're not replacing it right away. A car has a certain life cycle. So for cars, the life cycle is about 10, 12 years. And so this is the time frame we're looking at for these transitions to happen. But I'm an optimist when it comes to this what I call grid parity for renewables and for a battery parity for electric vehicles, because we already see it. Grid parity for wind, for onshore wind for sure, offshore wind, we're getting there very quickly. We also see grid parity for geothermal, which we haven't even tapped in Canada, which we have tapped in other jurisdictions. So we do see these technological trends unfolding because of investment and commitment from major companies to pursue these new markets because they are extremely attractive.
I make the point all the time that the energy transition is not a creature of climate policy. It is a thing that stands on its own. It is a process that's independent of policy, influenced by, but independent of, and really driven by the things that drive every economic transformation, like changing technology, capital investment, markets and consumer. All of that is changing. And I think, from my point of view, Professor Antweiler, the change is coming faster than I expected. I thought it would be, because of high costs of things like batteries, I thought it would proceed much more slowly than it is. Are you a little surprised at how the pace has picked up even in the last couple of years?
I'm pleasantly surprised that the pace has picked up because there is a critical point where the big players in the markets sink money into more development and more innovation. And we see this innovation now being accelerated after many false starts. Many of the car makers, for example, have tinkered with electric vehicles over the last 20 years, and it went nowhere. And now we see first the hybrids, the plug-in hybrids, and fully battery electric vehicles taking up. And part it's because we have reached a sweet spot where these vehicles not only provide a cleaner use, but they also have really great performance, and that is what people care about. And that's the reason why companies like Tesla and others like BMW that have brought out fully electric vehicles are being seen in the marketplace, because they combine the electric component but with these extra features. They are luxury vehicles. So that's the reason why at the first we see uptake in that market segment, but now it's trickling down to broader use. We see the Nissan Leaf and other vehicles in the marketplace that are geared at their different kinds of consumers. So the transition is happening at a more rapid pace now. It's only to a small extent driven by climate policy, because not very many jurisdictions have climate policies. It's really driven by the fact that we've had certain breakthroughs in technology that make EVs attractive. I should also mention a little bit about the role that fossil fuels still have to play, because natural gas still has an important role to play as a backup for renewables for a number of years. And so we won't see a very quick exit from fossil fuels in all areas, because they still have a very important role to play in certain parts, and we still will see a use in, of fossil fuels for trucks, which are much more difficult to electrify in the next number of years. Eventually we may get there, but in the technology makes it more attractive to use these types of fuels for some time. The same we will see in the aeronautical business. There are some experiments with hybrid planes, and we may actually see hybrid planes in the next number of years. Airbus and other companies are working on those technologies, but we won't see fully electric planes for many years to come, simply because of the weight issue with batteries. So all that said, maybe I should actually back up. We do see some commercial use of batteries in planes. Harbor Air here in Vancouver actually just is now experimenting with the first fully electric float plane. So even there we see innovation, but it's going to be taking some time, especially for larger commercial jets, before we see any major uptake of electrical turbines.
Last question. Any final thoughts, Professor Antweiler, on the second age of electricity?
Yeah, I'm an optimist when it comes to electricity. I see that there is both a huge opportunity to wean ourselves off fossil fuels in applications like the use of cars. And that has not only the benefit of being good for reducing climate impact, but also for reducing urban pollution, because vehicles contribute a lot to urban pollution. So there are multiple benefits from this transition, even though we are, of course, focused on the situation with our climate, but it also has very important local benefits, and it will transform our industries, simply because we are moving into many applications where electricity is a key form of energy. I mentioned IT earlier, and information technology is, of course, electricity intensive. So as we are moving more into these kinds of services that depend on electricity, you see more use of that. But we're still catching up in terms of infrastructure. So in addition to your and my choice about, for example, what kind of car we own, it's also the investments we need into the infrastructure for the electricity grid that will play a very important role. Because where renewable energy can be harvested more cheaply is often at a large distance to where people would like to use the electricity. So we do need investments coming from the public sector as well. And that is not just driven by climate policy, but it needs to be driven by decisions made by the utilities and governments to invest into that infrastructure of the 21st century.
Professor Antweiler, thank you very much for this. This has been fascinating, and we'll look forward to chatting with you again in the near future.
My pleasure.